Let's recall that even before the outbreak of war between the Spanish Empire and the United States in 1898, there was already a conflict, a revolutionary conflict fought between the Cuban nationalists and their Spanish colonial oppressors. Of course, the Cuban revolutionaries were fighting for independence and to establish their own sovereign country. Now, once you have war declared by the United States against the Spanish Empire, you see the United States government proclaiming its support of the Philippine nationalists, the Philippine revolutionaries, in their fight against the Spanish colonial masters. And as with the Cubans, the Filipino leaders believed the Americans, they believed in the general principles of liberty and democracy that America espoused, that America indeed represented. Now, the Filipino leaders felt, in other words, that the United States would indeed grant them sovereignty, that they would not colonize the United States once Spain was officially defeated by the United States. Yet, as it would happen, the United States turned its back on the Filipino revolutionary leaders and went on to formally claim and annex the archipelago as official American territory. And this is despite, vehement protests from the Philippine leaders, not to mention protests at home. Let's recall the Anti-Imperialist League, right? And thus began this conflict known as the Philippine-American War, fought between 1899 and 1902, though I have to say, officially it ended in 1902, but military conflict continued in the hinterland, so to speak, until 1913, right before the onset of World War I. And this war, just some general observations about it before we discuss it in more detail. This war is still in many ways relegated to this minor footnote in, the American historical narrative in U.S. military history. In fact, initially, in earlier history books, it was framed as a, quote, insurrection, a very mild way of putting this war. Okay, and furthermore, what's omitted in the historical record is the tremendous loss of life that happened among the Filipino, especially the civilian population, right? The amount of destruction and devastation wrought by this war, again, suffered by Filipinos. And this despite the tenacious and even sometimes fanatical resistance that the Filipinos displayed against the American military effort to, quote, pacify, unquote. This is the official term that the U.S. used in this war. They needed to pacify the Filipino resistance. But to be honest, the Filipinos were bound to lose this war because the United States, needless to say, is vastly superior in terms of arms, modern military strategy, certainly money, expenditure cost to prosecute this war. Now, I usually ask this question in a classroom setting. I usually ask the question of how many of you have heard of this war prior to this class? And usually I get anywhere from a third, sometimes less, okay? And sometimes about roughly half the class raise their hand. And then I ask them how many have heard of the previous Spanish-American war, right, that led to the Philippine-American War. Almost everyone has heard of the Spanish-American War. The only people who really haven't heard of it were perhaps those students who were educated in a different country, right? So this brings up an interesting historical question when it comes to the American historical consciousness, right? This general populace, right? American populace. Why is the Spanish-American War much more known by Americans compared to the Philippine-American War, when in fact the Philippine-American War led to more American casualties compared to the Spanish-American War, certainly involved more expenditure, lasted longer than the Philippine-American War. Okay, so longer in duration, higher in casualty, definitely more costly, and not to mention the historical significance of the first colonial war in American history. That is, now we are trying to subdue population from their efforts to become colonized, right? And previous to the Philippine-American War, those types of wars, colonial wars, were fought by, let's say, the English Empire against their colonial subjects in India or, parts of the Middle East. Certainly the French Empire, right? And parts of Indochina, what we call Vietnam today, right? But now we are actually fighting this war against this people that we wish to colonize, to subjugate and subdue. All right, so this is very important in the annals of the historical record. So despite all these facts I just delineated, why is the Philippine-American War less known? Why this historical amnesia surrounding this war despite its crucial importance in U.S. history? Okay, so let's go over a chronology of military events during this war. How does this war break out initially, and why? Well, for that, we have to back up a little bit to the Spanish-American War. And once the United States declared war against Spain with the explosion of the USS Maine, remember that event where the U.S. warship was docked in Cuba and led to the loss of American lives, well, war was declared, and the American Navy fleet, the Far East Navy Fleet, as they called it back then, commanded by Commodore Dewey, or Admiral Dewey, he was ordered to leave Hong Kong and take the American fleet to Manila and basically engage with the Spanish fleet. And it was an overwhelming victory. By the way, this demonstrates this new era in the, quote, modern Navy, the modernized Navy. Let's recall Alfred Thayer Mahan, who I introduced in a previous slide, and he's writing about the influence of sea power, right, in military history. At this point, it's realized by all the empires that whoever controls the seas controls the world. Okay, so it was crucial to modernize your Navy and in the process, engage in that imperial rivalry and gaining territory abroad. Now, by the way, Mahan would influence other empires, the English Empire, Germany, even Japan. Okay, the Japanese Empire will be emerging at this time, and we'll discuss this in Unit 2. By the way. Okay, so the Philippines is seen as a perfect place geostrategically, to use our term. For example, perfect place for military installations, perfect harbors for military naval bases, and coaling stations, right, to supply coal to these new modern ships. And during this time when Admiral Dewey defeats the Spanish Empire, and again, this is before the Philippine-American War is underway, there's this informal alliance between the Philippine revolutionaries and the U.S. Navy there. And indeed, the Filipinos are resuming their revolutionary war against Spain. So here's the Spanish Empire fighting both the revolutionaries, Philippine revolutionaries, right, and also fighting the Americans, right? But with the defeat of the Spanish Navy by Admiral Dewey, you see the city of Manila basically controlled by the United States. All right, and you see the arrival of the U.S. Army right after that. So you have the Navy and then followed by the U.S. Army. And because of this, many Philippine leaders began to worry about the intentions of the United States in their country, right? Of course, they were promised independence, but what's the deal with the influx of the Army, right? Shouldn't the Army be uninvolved in this? And at this time, you have the formation of the Philippine government, because, of course, their expectation was to actually form this government, the sovereign state, right? The leader of this government, and here's a slide, is this guy named Emilio Aguinaldo. And he's the revolutionary leader of the first Philippine Republic, okay? And by the way, they call this the Malolos Constitution. Malolos is a region in the Philippines, which therefore the namesake of the Constitution. Okay, and notice it forms in 1899. Right. Okay, so the Philippines is on its way to becoming a sovereign nation. But as I just mentioned, here comes the Army. And therefore you have, with the influx of the Army, this uneasy coexistence between U.S. troops, the Navy, and the Army, as well as the Philippine revolutionaries. And they're both amassed in the capital of the Philippines, which is Manila. And indeed, Manila is claimed because, I didn't mention this earlier, but Spain decides to hand over Manila to the United States rather than giving it to the Filipino revolutionaries, right? So, there you go. So again, this uneasy coexistence, right, fraught with tension. And indeed, what would happen is, because of their close proximity, it would evolve to the point where this tension would flare out in the open in the form of military hostility. This officially happened in February 1899. Where, the U.S. troops were trying to order some Filipinos, to halt. Of course, Philippines, the Filipino Army didn't recognize the United States as their superiors. They refused, and then Americans fired upon them. Filipinos fired back, and this led to the influx of even more troops, American troops, to Manila. Okay, and this would happen in the weeks following the outset of conflicts. Okay, in fact, about 13,000 American troops arrived then. So, by February 5th, 1899, U.S. troops decide to attack the Filipino garrisons surrounding the city, comprised of the Revolutionary Army, right? That were fighting the Spanish. Now they're fighting the American troops. And moreover, let's remember Commodore Dewey, right? He's ordered to fire the Navy guns upon the Filipino Army in their encampments around Manila. So they basically drive out the Filipinos, from Manila, the Filipino troops. And again, this Malolos government, led by Aguinaldo, is forced to flee Manila. And they go to the mountains of northern Luzon, where they could hide out. Okay, so during this first month of fighting, this is what you could call the conventional period, where conventional warfare is fought. Okay, and that's, by the way, in contrast to the guerrilla war, where it's unconventional. And we'll get into that with the next slide.